Okay, let's get started. My name is Christopher Wong-Michelson, and on behalf of Evgenia Lisova, my co-host, I would like to welcome everybody and say good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody around the world who is joining us for this second of three parts of a Meaningful Work Foundations series. And of course, we are thrilled to have two experts, Katie Bailey and Thaddeus Metz, with us to have a conversation about what is meaning and how is it different from meaningfulness. So we will begin with a 30-minute dialogue between the two of them, and then we will allow 30 minutes at the end for questions and answers, which will be moderated by Evgenia. So if you do have a question, feel free to direct it to her through the Q&A button, and we will get to that back and forth between our experts and the audience at that point. First, I just want to say a little bit about this series. We began the Meaningful Work Foundation series when we recognized that, number one, there was an interest in a global community of scholars studying the meaning of work and meaningful work. But I said it that way intentionally because I think one thing that we realized was that there are some fundamental matters on which we either have some subtle disagreements or we simply don't really reflect on the differences between the phrases that we use to describe our field of study. Do we study the meaning of work or do we study meaningful work? And does it matter? Is there a difference? So part one of our series explored the question, what is meaningful work? This part is focusing on the differences, if any, between meaning and meaningfulness. So I would like to ask each of our experts to say a little bit about themselves and their work before we dive more deeply into the question of meaning and meaningfulness, starting with Catherine Bailey, who I call Katie, if that's okay. We've known each other for quite some time. And she is Emeritus Professor at King's College and also works at Northumbria in the United Kingdom. Katie, will you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work?
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you so much for the invitation to you and to Evgenia for today's event. Really excited to be able to talk about meaningful work. As you've said, I'm an Emerita Professor at King's College in London, and I'm Professor of Work and Employment, Professor of Leadership and HRM at Northumbria University. I've got too many titles, which is just a fractional appointment. So I'm semi-retired now, but I've been researching meaningful work for about the past 15 years. And I think the thing that really got me into the subject was I was researching around employee engagement. That was what my focus was at the time. And I read a very interesting paper by William Kahn, which looked at the factors that can drive up a sense of engagement with work. And he identified meaningfulness as one of those. And I was very struck by the paper and the way he talked about meaningfulness and really wanted to find out more about what this was and what it meant. And it turned out that this was actually quite an exciting time to join the debate about meaningful work because there was a huge amount of interest just starting to bubble up. Obviously, people have been researching it for some time. In psychology, we can trace it back to Hackman and Oldham's work in the 1970s, but many thousands of years, of course, in philosophy, ethics, and the humanities and so on. But there's been an absolute upsurge in interest in the topic in recent years, and it's been brilliant to be able to work with people, colleagues from around the world, including yourselves, Christopher and Evgenia. It's been lovely to be able to work with you and other people with this sort of shared interest around meaningful work. Most of my research in the area has been qualitative, based on talking to people about what makes their work meaningful or indeed meaningless to them. Not so much on the meaning of work, but obviously that has to be considered alongside meaningfulness. I've also been lucky enough to collaborate with teams, co-editing a couple of special issues in different journals, and also the Oxford Handbook on Meaningful Work. So that's a bit about me. Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you so much, Katie. And as a fellow philosopher with Thaddeus Metz, I will say, yes, philosophers have been studying these topics for thousands of years, but it wasn't until management scholars started commercializing these topics that the study of meaning, at least in the popular life, sort of took off. So that's a lamentation of philosophers throughout the ages, that they study things before others popularize them. So this is the first time that we've actually talked, Thaddeus. May I call you Thad?
Sure.
Um, and I think you're new to a lot of people who will be tuning into this conversation. So we would love to hear about you and your work at the University of Pretoria in South Africa.
Right. I'm originally from the US. I grew up in Iowa, did my PhD in philosophy at Cornell way back in the mid 1990s now. But soon after that, I moved to South Africa and have lived in Johannesburg for the past 25 years. I've published 4 books on the meaning of life and lots of different articles. I think probably my most important book is called Meaning in Life, an Analytic Study, which appeared with OUP in 2013. And as a philosopher, I approach the topic philosophically. I'm probably known best for giving my religiously inclined colleagues some grief. So I've tended to champion the idea that neither God nor a soul is essential for a life to be meaningful, and have worked to articulate a more atheistic or naturalist alternative understanding of what would make our lives meaningful. And I'm also known for thinking about what talk of meaning means, which is why I imagine you've had me here today. And I have the lead chapter in the Oxford Handbook on the philosophy of meaning in life is precisely about what we have in mind when we are debating about meaningfulness or life's meaning. I think this audience might appreciate a fun fact about me, which is that I was once mentioned as a clue on the game show Jeopardy in relation to the meaning of life. And the answer was a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry written by Thaddeus Metz, or a movie written by John Cleese. And that was the answer to the question, what is the meaning of life?
I love it. I think we can all appreciate that, except for those of us who are too young to remember John Cleese. I'm not one of those who's too young. That's wonderful. So thank you both for those introductions, and thank you for your work in this area. I think this will be a really interesting conversation on the topic at hand, meaning and meaningfulness, but also we might stray into conversations about how meaning in work and in life relate to each other. I don't think we talk often about the role of God or a soul in meaningful work, but maybe we ought to. So I can see this going in many interesting directions. So what I would like to do now is just quickly set up the conversation and then leave it to the two of you to have that conversation. So I will say I have read your book that you mentioned, Thad, but you sent me a more recent book of yours that I've been reading called What Makes Life Meaningful with Joshua Sechrist, I believe. And in that book, you say that Anglo-American philosophers tend to distinguish between meaning of life and meaning in life, which reminded me, Katie, of ways in which management scholars sometimes distinguish between meaning of work, meaning in work, and meaning at work. So that's just one taste of the messiness of this seemingly easy question about meaning and meaningfulness. My co-author and I, Gentosti Karas, tried to make a simple distinction in a recent book called The Meaning and Purpose of Work between what we called semantic meaning, in other words, the meaning of words, and significant meaning, what matters or makes life full of meaning. But we didn't suppose that that was the end of the story. Maybe it's just the beginning of the conversation. So with that set up, Thad and Katie, take it away, and then I will remind our audience that Evgenia will step in to moderate Q&A between the audience and our experts at about 1:30. So maybe Katie, you can comment first on this phenomenon.
Gosh, thank you, Christopher. You've asked an awful lot of questions there, and they're quite difficult to answer, most of them. I suppose from my perspective, my research has been around meaningful work, and I see that as being different from the meaning of work, just looking at it at a very simple level. So I think Rousseau and colleagues in a paper back in 2010 had a good way of looking at it, and they say that meaning making or meaning is the output of having made sense of something or having derived meaning from it, which is very much what you were saying just now when you talked about this notion of a semantic meaning. So meanings can be positive, negative, or maybe neutral, whereas meaningful work that is full of meaning, however we want to define that. And of course, there are many different ways of defining meaningful work. When we did a review of the literature a few years ago, we found just from the psychology literature, 28 different scales for measuring meaningful work. So, and that's without taking into account sociological perspectives or philosophical perspectives. So I think that there is that distinction between what work means as opposed to meaningful work, and the meaning of work. So work can mean a number of different things, and we can look at that in terms of work centrality or orientation towards work. One of the most famous typologies that's referred to is the work of Bella, who said that work can be a job, a calling, or a career. So a job, we go to work, we want the paycheck, we get more meaning perhaps from other aspects. A career, we go to work because we want to progress, we want the status and so on. And a calling is either, and this is maybe links in with some of the things that Thad is going to be talking about. Callings can be a kind of an external summons to where you feel impelled to go and do work for a particular cause, which can be a transcendental cause, or through a sense of wanting positive fulfillment for yourself. You feel called to go and do something, for example, creative. My current research is looking at people who are ceramic artists, for example, who experience their work as a calling. So you can have these different orientations, and others have given different typologies. John Budd, for example, famously talked about 10 different meanings of work. So work can be a curse, it can be a source of disutility, a source of freedom, it can be about fulfillment or caring. So there are different ways of looking at the meaning of work as distinct from meaningful work. And I don't know if that resonates with the research that you've been doing on the grander scale of life itself.
I think the relevant distinction for my work, or what philosophers tend to do, would be the meaningful work, would be a kind of work that is that's positive, right? It's desirable. It's something we want to choose and we want to support. So we philosophers are in the first instance interested in values. What's worth pursuing in life. And so we're going to find meaningfulness or significance to be one of those values as something distinct from happiness or morality. And so I think philosophers will think to some degree about meaningful work. But a lot of us are interested in a more comprehensive principle of what would make life meaningful. And so we would say, well, work could be one source, and family is probably going to be another, and certain kinds of political participation, fighting injustice could be a third, religion could be a fourth. And so we try to take a very comprehensive account of what would make our lives meaningful, where work would be potentially one. When it comes to the meaningfulness of work, I think, I'm not familiar with that distinction as it functions in your field, but what occurs to me is that it might mean two different things. On the one hand, it might mean something semantic. It might have something to do with sort of the meaningfulness of that a word or a sentence would have. So we might talk about what work expresses or connotes. But another thing it might mean is that work is meaningful to a person, or a person finds his or her work meaningful. And that strikes me as a third use of meaning here. It's a more psychological sense. It's the kind of way of approaching meaning that would be natural for a psychologist to approach. He or she would get a report from a worker and ask, is this meaningful to you, or do you find it meaningful? And it'd be yes or no, and for whatever reasons. And I think this notion, the psychological notion or subjective notion of meaning, is different from the philosophical notion of what we might call objectively valuable or worth pursuing. And I also think it's different from the semantic notion of what words mean or sentences mean. So I think we've got three big notions here that we need to prize apart and try to keep distinct.
I think just picking up on that point about the sort of the subjective versus the sort of objective normative angle on meaningful work, I think that's you've very much got to the heart of the key issue there. One of the key debates that we tend to have in meaningful work: is it a subjective experience? So if I go into work and I find my work meaningful, does that mean that it is meaningful? Or are there certain types of jobs that are intrinsically more meaningful than others? For example, caring jobs, are they more meaningful than factory jobs, for example? And there's been a big trend recently to look at craft and creative jobs as being especially meaningful. This sort of sense of creating something in the world. This is something that Sennett has written about, and Crawford have written really interesting books looking at the fact that the way that work is developing now, we're losing contact with material things around us, and that sense of creating something. And it did strike me when I was interviewing people about meaningful work, and in a paper I had out fairly recently, we did sort of touch on this, although it wasn't a key consideration, was that some of the people doing the more intangible jobs like solicitors and so on talked about, well, actually in some ways I wish I did something else. I wish I was a carpenter, because at the end of the day I'd have a beautiful thing to show people, a table or a chair or something, whereas I can't say, well, look at this amazing trust deed that I've drawn up today. It doesn't give that same sense of meaningfulness. So I think, as you say, there's this sort of this subjective idea, well, do I find my work meaningful? And that's really important to know, because even if a job is maybe objectively meaningful, the person may not find it to be meaningful. Many of the solicitors that we spoke to in our study didn't find their work especially meaningful all the time for those reasons. And the other thing, of course, is the societal, political, economic level as well. As a society, what kind of jobs do we want people to do? What jobs do we see as a society as being meaningful? And those sort of societal level messages can then get transferred to individuals and affect how they see their own work. So we had, for example, nurses in our study very much affected by the kind of feedback that they were getting, not just from patients about the work that they did, but from the sort of broader messages they were getting from the social and cultural environment they worked in about whether their work was valued or not. I'm not sure if that's something that crops up in philosophy as well. Do you think about this idea about the sort of the broader setting within which work takes place, and in relation to how the individual feels about it?
Absolutely. So the subjective-objective distinction is pretty crucial to our field, or has been for the past 50 years or so of debate. I think most philosophers of life's meaning would say that merely the subjective finding something meaningful is desirable. We want that, but that it's not enough. So we can think of a hypothetical Sisyphus who was mythically condemned by the Greek gods to roll a stone up a hill, and then the stone rolls down and he's forced to roll it back up the hill, and it goes on forever. We've got work there, And we can even imagine that the gods implant in Sisyphus the sense that it's meaningful. But, stepping back from an external perspective, it's not a life any of us would want. And it's certainly not what we would hope that our children or our students end up doing with their lives. So it's important to have a sense, a subjective sense, that what one is doing is meaningful. But most philosophers of life's meaning would say it really should be meaningful as well. It'd be much better if the work were creative, if it weren't repetitive, if it weren't isolating, if it did result in some sort of tangible, lasting, beautiful object. These would all make the work objectively meaningful in a way that most philosophers think is really where the action is.
I'm just going to interject and say that the mythical Greek gods that are implanting Sisyphus with this idea that pushing a boulder up a hill is meaningful are at war with each other. They're famously fallible. Whereas I think in the modern tradition of monotheistic tradition, God is all powerful, all knowing, all benevolent, everywhere, all at once. And some people do have the sense that what makes their work meaningful is that it fulfills God's plan. So I'm wondering, Katie, does that come into meaningful work research at all, this God and soul-centered idea of meaningfulness?
Well, I think it very much does once we start looking at work as a calling. And this is something that Evgenia, you've researched quite a bit yourself as well. So I think there seem to be two main sort of branches within the callings literature. One looks at a calling as a summons from God to do good work in furtherance of God. And from that perspective, yes, anything that is regarded from a theological perspective then is regarded as being meaningful work, whatever that work is, almost regardless of the content of the work or even the organizational setting within which it takes place. Kind of going back to your original question, Christopher, about the difference between meaning of work and at work and in work. And then the other branch of the callings literature, which is more the one that I'm investigating at the moment, is more this sort of a deep sense of personal fulfillment and joy in doing certain types of work that you feel really called to do. And so from that point of view, this idea of the being driven by God is not so relevant. There is a debate about whether actually that can be properly called a calling if there is no religious element to it. And I think that's possibly yet another debate. But I'm guessing that this is very much infused in the research you're doing, Thad, and meaning in life.
Sure. In addition to the subjective-objective distinction, a really big one is our conceptions of meaning that are focused on the supernatural, or what we would call the spiritual, God and the soul, and other views of meaning in life that aren't inherently religious, and that propose that even if we live in a world without God or a soul, meaningful lives are still possible. And what's to be said in favor of the latter view is to imagine there is some bad news. Imagine we are alone. God didn't create the universe. There isn't a plan for us. We're not going to survive the deaths of our bodies. That's not good news for many of us. And yet, we can still distinguish, it seems, between some lives that really have quite a bit of meaning in them and other lives that don't intuitively. And so if we look at the lives of Albert Einstein or Nelson Mandela or Toni Morrison or Pablo Picasso, I'm inclined to find those as exemplars, right? They're very rich in meaning, and they're ideals to strive for as human beings. In any event, they've got much more meaning in their lives than does somebody who is extremely addicted to opiates and just spends life chasing the next fix. Surely we can draw a distinction between the quality of these lives, even if we are not so lucky as to have souls that will go to heaven and meet our Maker.
Katie, I just have to point out that the 4 examples Thad gave, Einstein, Mandela, Picasso, Morrison, the meaningfulness of their lives, we might attribute to the meaningfulness of their work.
I think that's a very interesting point. Yes, and I think one of the things we haven't perhaps talked about yet is around work centrality in life, and how central work is, or perhaps should be, in a meaningful life. I think that isn't it the case that these lottery tests tend to show that even if people won the lottery, they'd still carry on working for the most part. And equally, I think the meaning of life studies tend to show that either work or family is the first item cited by people when they're asked about what was the main source of their meaning, with work coming first in many cases. So work is highly central to people in terms of what their life means to them, I think, and also the meaningfulness of it. So if you're spending most of your hours working and you're in a job that doesn't feel meaningful to you, or it isn't objectively meaningful, then that's going to affect the meaning of your life overall as well, I think. So this is another factor, I think, that is important. But I think I have actually got a question for you, Thad, because you've mentioned 4 incredible people there in your example of what would constitute a meaningful life. Most of us can't aspire to that. Does that mean that the rest of us, is the choice between, extreme meaningfulness or none at all? Or is there some sort of a middle ground where perhaps most of us sit?
Yeah, I and many of my colleagues will go reaching for exemplars, right? Where we've just got a clear instance of a meaningful life. And those folks, yes, they're luminaries, and they're hard to match. But if we value Einstein because of the knowledge he discovered, presumably we could also take pride and esteem in just having gotten that bachelor's degree and educated ourselves to some extent. Or if we value Picasso because of his paintings and Morrison because of her amazing novels, perhaps we can do some poetry in our spare time that we publish in a local journal. We value Mandela for having liberated a country from apartheid, racial segregation, but we ourselves can go do some volunteer work and impart some meaning in our lives that way. So the suggestion isn't that we've got to be like these folks to have meaningful lives, but they are touchstones. They will give us clues as to what we should strive for, I think.
So I just want to do a time check. We're about halfway through. I don't see any questions from the audience yet, so I'm going to ask the audience one more time to submit your questions, and Evgenia will take it from there. But before we transition to the Q&A, maybe I'll just ask a closing question for this portion of our program, returning to the original question of this dialogue. What is meaning and how is it different from meaningfulness? I'd like to ask each of you, is it important for us to be more careful than perhaps historically we have been in our research to be clear about what we mean when we're talking about meaning and meaningfulness and the difference between them?
I mean, from my point of view, when talking about meaningful work, I personally agree with you, Christopher. I think it's really important to be very clear. Are we talking about what work means to someone, or are we talking about whether their work is meaningful to them? Or whether we can consider that work to be meaningful. And I think that is an important distinction. But I think it's a sort of finer grade distinction than that, even in that if we're looking at meaningful work, we need to be very clear what definition of meaningful work we're using. And I've been as guilty of this as anyone, I think. I've used different definitions of meaningful work when writing about meaningful work in different ways. I think what I've tried to do is to be consistent in actually being clear what the definition is that I'm using, so that people can see what conversation we're contributing to in our paper. But it does make advancing the literature on meaningful work perhaps exciting, but also problematic as we try and navigate the distinction between these various different definitions that we have. But I do agree with you. I think it's really important to be clear.
I certainly think that's true. And what I tend to do, if there's a word that's ambiguous, is avoid using the word altogether. So if I were to talk about psychological meaning or subjective meaning, I would just avoid using that phrase probably and just pose questions like, do these people think they've achieved a worthwhile purpose? Or do they have a sense of self-actualization? So it's focused on subjective reports. If I were talking about semantic meaning, I would ask, what does this word or sentence connote? Or what is this gesture expressing? And then if I were interested in the philosophical value that Christopher's been calling significance, I would ask questions like, does this activity merit devotion and admiration? Is this something that, looking back on my deathbed, I would be reasonable to take pride in having done? And I think, there are ways of sort of translating to express really the key point we want. And that's one way to avoid confusion, is just not to use the word meaning at all.
Well, that's a bold proposition, and I'm loving this conversation so far. I have to say, Evgenia and I haven't decided exactly what the guiding question is going to be for part 3, but you've already touched upon some of the candidates, such as whether there's a difference between objective and subjective meaning, the difference, if any, between meaning and purpose, and so on. So lots to think about. And Evgenia, I'm going to hand it over to you to continue the dialogue.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, I didn't have any questions, so one more call for questions if there are any. I really much enjoyed the conversation, and I think I would like, because I'm someone who is also trying to think practical, and I do teach about meaningfulness and meaning partly as well. So I was very much interested your thoughts on how empirically, if we are to also educate future PhD students, for instance, how to capture it, because I don't think it's, I find it fascinating, this bold sentence, we need to not mention that at all, but I was wondering how we can capture it, because I know Katie was doing qualitative work and you do philosophical work, how we can capture it empirically, perhaps, when we think about meaningfulness, just to make sure we're capturing the right thing. Because I do find also in my work we have a special issue. There was some conversation: is it really about meaningful work, this paper, or is it about meaning? So anything that maybe you can have some thoughts on empirical work or like conceptual work on how to work with those challenging topics. Any input will be much appreciated.
Well, thanks, Evgenia. Do you know, I think that's such an important question. And I review quite a lot of papers for journals and on meaningful work. And I think one of the main reasons that papers tend to get rejected, that are unfortunately sent into journals, is that it's just simply not clear that the paper is about meaningful work, as opposed to maybe job satisfaction or commitment or something like that. And so designing research studies that really tap into meaningfulness is a challenge that I think we all face. And of course, if you go in and ask people, do you find your work meaningful? The first thing that people will then ask you is, well, what do you mean by that? So then you then have to define it for the person. And then in some senses, by defining it for them, you're then kind of leading them into a particular way of looking at their work that perhaps they might not have thought of before. So I very much like Thad's idea of maybe designing projects that tap into the different dimensions of meaningful work without necessarily talking directly about meaningfulness unless it feels appropriate at the time. And I think one of the things perhaps we haven't talked about too much is the idea that meaningfulness is not a kind of a one-dimensional characteristic of work. It has multiple different dimensions. So if you look at the work of Lips Wiersma, for example, or Rosso and colleagues, they've got 4 different dimensions of meaningful work to think about, sort of in terms of self-fulfillment, of contribution to others, the sense of belonging and being part of a greater cause, and so on. And I think it's important, as linking in with the earlier conversation about which definition are you using, to think about, well, what questions would tap into the different dimensions within the definition that you're using. But it's not an easy thing to do at all. I agree, Evgenia.
Perhaps it would be useful for people to not merely get clear on the question they want to pose or to answer, but also to realize that to sort of think about how the kinds of answers they're going to get are going to differ. So I think there are features of semantic meaning that we don't find in meaning as significance or meaningfulness. So, for example, if we're asking whether a word or a sentence is meaningful, that sort of looks binary. It looks like it's 1 or 0. It either is meaningful or it's not. Whereas when we are talking about meaningfulness, that looks like it comes in degrees or has some kind of magnitude. Another interesting contrast, or important one, I think, is that meaningfulness, as I said earlier, for most of us is something good for its own sake. It's something we want in a life. It's positive. It's worth choosing. Whereas the meaningfulness of a word or a gesture or a sentence, it doesn't have that feature. It's neutral. I think there's a closer relationship between the sort of psychological subjective meaning and significant meaning. So those both admit of degrees, right? Somebody can find their work really meaningful, or the work can itself be really meaningful, as opposed to not. But I think one likely difference between them is that, again, the significant meaning is inherently positive, whereas it looks possible for somebody to find work meaningful that really just isn't. And we want to say, you're making a mistake here. So I'm sure, to use the proverbial Hitler case, I'm sure he thought his project of purifying the Aryan race, I'm sure he found it meaningful. It was meaningful to him. But for most philosophers, at least, we would balk at thinking that that's something worth choosing, or that he was correct. And so I think trying to think of the differences between these kinds of meaning might be useful in keeping them distinct.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And we actually got a question, so from Devin. Thanks, Devin, so much for the question. So I'm gonna call it out now. So some are called to a meaningful work in their lives and experience that calling and the sense of purpose before they begin the work. But can work also become meaningful? Can meaningfulness emerge or be discovered in the process of doing the work? If so, how might one begin to explore the potential meaningfulness in their own work?
I really like that question, Devin. Thank you very much indeed. I think there's been much more interest in recent times, and Evgenia, you've written about this yourself, in the idea that meaningfulness is not a sort of a steady state, but can ebb and flow, can emerge and disappear, depending on the job that you're doing, even what's happening during the working day. And so, yes, I think very much that you can be feel called to do a certain type of work, and then ultimately come to find your calling not to be fulfilling, or you can start a job without particularly strong feelings about it, and then after a while come to see it as deeply meaningful. In some senses, it's a sort of a meeting between the properties of the job and the conditions of work and your own experiences and attitudes towards it. So I would say very much it is something that can be explored and so on, and found through the work that you do. In terms of the last part of your question about how you could explore the potential meaningfulness in your own work, what I tend to do when I go into organizations is I use a framework of meaningfulness, and I often use Mario Lex-Wiersma's framework, which divides the sense of meaningfulness into 4 different quadrants. And I ask people to think about their own work in terms of each of those quadrants, and then that helps then to identify where perhaps there are deficits in meaning. So, for example, you might find the tasks that you do to be incredibly meaningful and fulfilling, but the relational side of your work might be not so good. You might not have be getting good feedback from your customers and not good working relationships with colleagues. And by breaking it down and looking at it at that level of detail, you can then start to think about how you could build up more of a sense of meaningfulness over time.
Yeah, I think to begin to see your work as more meaningful, it would be helpful to specify aspects of it that in fact are meaningful. And so I'm curious about the other quadrants that Katie's poses to people. But I would have thought that, directing people to ask, well, are you creative on the job? Or are you developing talents of yours at work? Of course, are you connecting with people and cooperating with them and have some sense of identity with them is another. Do you do some real good for consumers? Is the product you or service you provide, does it actually improve their quality of life, or does it just maximize profit? Is there some kind of achievement in your work, right? Is there a progression, an improvement, as opposed to a stasis or a repetitiveness? And finally, another relevant question, it seems to me, is are you recognized positively for your accomplishments? That is, I think, 6 different questions to ask, and that people might pose to themselves when trying to find meaning in what they're doing.
Thank you very much. I think that there's a lot of also practical ideas of helping people, but also putting it in more in research terms. Another interesting question that popped up from Alexander concerns a very interesting topic of meaningless work. Right? So we tend to talk about meaningful work, but what about meaningless work? What do we actually currently know about meaningless work? Can the way we capture, for instance, meaningful work, can it be used for capturing meaningless work? So I'm just switching, a more low number for that. But it doesn't seem that entirely capture meaningless. So I would like some reflection in what is maybe meaningless work. Is it just an opposite of meaningful, or something more than that? And how we can best capture that? Very interesting question.
Oh, that's a great question, Alexandre. And I kind of agree with you. I think if you're using a psychological scale that looks at meaningful work, if you've got low scores on that, does that just indicate the absence of meaningfulness rather than the presence of meaninglessness? So are they 2 different things? Or is meaningfulness something that can just be measured in terms of strength or weakness? I mean, I kind of implicitly in your question, I think you're saying that you don't think meaninglessness is the same as the absence of meaningfulness. And I think I kind of agree with you. I did some research a few years ago where we looked at meaningless work actually among 4 different groups, and we found 4 different sources of meaninglessness, which were powerlessness, or feeling that you were being closely monitored and controlled at work, feeling disconnected from other people, feeling devalued by other people, and self-doubt. I know those map pretty well onto a lot of the psychological theories that we know about in relation to meaningless work. I'm not actually aware of a scale to measure meaninglessness, because I think that actually takes us into territory. Is meaninglessness the same as alienation? Which is or is meaninglessness or absence of meaningfulness a driver or an antecedent to alienation. And there's been some research on that, which I did a few years ago with a colleague. It's getting into quite complicated territory there. It might be getting a bit too much into the weeds. But Evgenia, actually, can I ask you about this? Because this is very much your area of expertise as well.
Yeah, so the same question. I personally find it also, I don't think necessarily that meaningful work so it's just the low score for the meaningless. I think it is something much more than that. It's really losing the sight of things and really, I mean, I don't have a definition or whatsoever or the way to measure it. That's for sure. But to me, it's certainly something more than that. And it's interesting to learn about this project you've been doing on alienation, meaninglessness. From this project, so there is a conversation, which one precedes another one. Is that's the challenge with this one? So because it seems to me a very nice path towards maybe trying to get more clarity of what meaninglessness is.
In philosophy, we've got some debate about what meaninglessness is. On the face of it, just looking at the word, meaninglessness looks like the absence of meaning. So you just take away the positive, and that's the meaninglessness. But a little reflection suggests that there can be kinds of meaninglessness or that are more substantive. They aren't merely the absence of a good, but they are a negative. They are undesirable. So, I mean, one way to see this is if you, many of us think, well, our lives are meaningful if we leave the world a better place than it was when we entered it, or than it would have existed had we not. But suppose we leave the world a worse place than it is had we not existed. That's not merely an absence of meaning. Looks like that's what is anti-meaningful. Or sometimes in philosophy we would say it anti-matters. So it's more like pain is the opposite of pleasure. It's not the mere absence of pleasure. It's something substantively negative to be avoided. And I think there are kinds of meaninglessness that are like pain. I think being destructive or having been mistreated, for example, are good candidates for things that reduce the meaning in your life, as opposed to are merely an absence of the positive good of meaning. But we need to develop a vocabulary for these things, and I think that's a job that needs to be done. Both by philosophers generally speaking, but it also sounds like folks doing research on meaningful work.
Yeah, thank you. It's actually, if I have to reflect on this conversation and the question that Katie has posed, I was wondering now, is it helpful, this subjective or normative, more objective view in the question of meaninglessness? So I was just wondering to what extent, if we look subjectively and try to ask ourselves, I don't think we can even say potentially that it's meaningless. So maybe we'll say there is an absence of meaning, but meaninglessness, it's only when we objectively look in this concept. I don't know if that makes sense, but I was just trying to play out whether the perspectives that we take might also help us to shed light on this concept.
Yeah, look, I think a good placeholder for a lot of talk of meaningfulness is what merits pride or esteem, or perhaps admiration from a third-party perspective. And so the negative correlate of that would be what merits shame, or what merits revulsion from a third-party perspective. And so it might be that if we're talking about the subjective side, the psychological sense of meaning, it might be that feelings of shame or revulsion with what one has done are the sort of antimatter, the negative correlate of finding something meaningful.
Thank Thank you very much. By the way, just wanted to share some words of appreciation from Devin for some more for your answers. And I'm also responding about the four-quadrant framework that Katie was mentioning as Liv's map of meaning that she was talking about. I'm also gonna answer to Devin privately, but we have one more question from Sveta. She's asking, can we say meaningfulness in a job can be measured in degrees, as in essential job components, or can be meaningful to me, but the non-essential job components are meaningless, but has to be done. Hence, my overall satisfaction decreases even I'm doing a meaningful job. So can we break it up and looking at the tasks that we do? Some are meaningful, some are meaningless, and how this overall shapes our work experience.
Well, that is a really good question, and it's one that I'm actually grappling with at the moment. Is it Sweta or Sweeta? I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. That I'm grappling with at the moment in my own research on callings, and I think it's something that, unless Christopher or Evgenia perhaps, or maybe Thad as well, from a more philosophical perspective, can answer. But how much of our job needs to be meaningful in order for us to give a global assessment of our job itself as a whole as being meaningful? And I don't really know the answer to that, and I think it's actually a really important question. If I'm an academic and I love teaching and I love research, but I hate admin, at what point does the hating the admin tip over into making me hate my whole job, or is it never going to, because the other parts outweigh it? I don't actually know the answer to that, but I do think it's incredibly important for us to think about, because all of our jobs have different elements to them. I think if Marjo Lipsviersma were here, she would probably say that you need to have all aspects of meaningfulness in place for a job to be deemed deeply meaningful. But nevertheless, even if just maybe one of her quadrants is in place, so for example, you may be able to express your full potential through work, but other aspects are not there so strongly, that would be enough for you to perceive your job as a whole as meaningful. But I'm not sure I have a complete answer to that question.
Look, I think it's possible to measure both the subjective psychological sense of meaning on the one hand, and at least in principle, a more objective meaningfulness or significance on the other. When it comes to how much people find their work meaningful, we can interview them and we can use Likert scales and quantify to some extent their answers. That doesn't look like a problem for me. And I would have thought that the more a job is creative, the more it actualizes your potential, the less isolating it is, the more good you do for consumers, the more achievement there is, the more recognition, the more meaning. And it's hard to attach numbers to those kinds of things. But it does seem like we want more of those rather than less. And so we've got some notion of magnitude at work here. I think the sort of the puzzle that is partly being posed in the question is that the subjective and the objective can come apart. We might have a very meaningful job and not find it so. We might be depressed for other reasons. And by the same token, we might find a particular job really meaningful, but be mistaken. I think, for example, if your main job is providing, slot machines to the public, I don't think I think you could be doing better work. You might want to rethink that one.
Thank you very much. There's still one more question, but I wanted to get an invitation of Katie to step in and chip in a couple of thoughts. I've been doing research in a company, and I think this question of how much of our work needs to be meaningful to actually have this full experience of meaning. I think it's a very interesting question. And the way I look at meaningfulness is also that a fluctuating experience. So I think what is interesting is not necessarily have a static, because if we look at just a job, it's quite a static view, then, 30% meaningless task or administrative task, and 70 are really creative that enables me to thrive. But I think it's really also changing through the days and the weeks. So I think the most important that we try to understand that there is a certain level balance that it's okay for you. There is a certain okay balance for you. Maybe it's okay to have 70 and 30, but if it keeps this way, but if it's you constantly gonna have weeks or days when you have 9 to 10, and 9-10 mean of administrative stuff and 10 what you really love. I mean, that's a different equation. So I think if we take a more dynamic perspective, that would also help to see, to unpack this different tasks within job as well. Last question I would like to take in from Saskia. Do you feel the research field is changing now that technology is playing such an important role in our work?
Well, this is very much something that we looked at in the special issue of the Journal of Business Ethics that Christopher and Evgenia played a key role in leading. And we had some very interesting papers looking at the role of technology in meaningful work. And I think it's, there's no escaping the huge transformation that is taking place in the world of work, affecting everybody. And that is inevitably going to have impacts on whether or not we find our work meaningful and where we find our work meaningful. And sorry, I think one of the things that we need to think about moving forward is how we can take account of these changes and also keep our research relevant in a context where work is going to be so very different. When on the one hand, you could argue that meaningfulness could increase because technology could take away the boring and mundane aspects of the work. So, excuse me. But on the other hand, it might take away those aspects of the work that we do find the most meaningful. So I don't think there's any one solution that's going to develop. And I think this is an area where we do definitely need more research.
Ted, would you like to chip in? We just have a couple of minutes.
I think that's really for the meaningful work experts. But I will say philosophers are also concerned and interested in the potential role of technology. We tend to take things to a bit more extreme measures, though. So a lot of us have been thinking about, well, suppose AI or robots ended up doing everything. Literally everything. I mean, suppose they could do just about anything. What would be left for us to do? Is there anything that we would still find worth doing, knowing that the machine could do it and do it better and more efficiently? So that's a kind of extreme endpoint that we reflect on. But presumably will have implications for less extreme situations.
Yeah, Christopher, I'm looking at the time, or we still have time? Is that the time?
I think that we need to wrap it up.
Time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to thanks everyone who sent in their question. By the way, everybody is also getting the words of appreciation for this wonderful dialogue, and we're very much thankful for the questions that were posed, and of course for wonderful answers from Ted and Katie in the conversation.
And I would like to add my thanks to Katie and Thad for a wonderful conversation that answered many questions, raised many others, and really moved this dialogue forward. Evgenia, thank you for being my partner in this project. And thank you all for attending. And to those of you who are listening to this as a recording, we thank you for your interest as well. Look out for an announcement about part 3 of this series coming in 2 or 3 months. We haven't chosen a date yet, but we will. Thank you, everybody.